It was in the latter years of Queen Victoria's long reign that I once more found myself established in our old rooms in Baker Street. My medical practice had been temporarily relinquished while my wife was absent in the country upon a visit to distant relatives. Holmes received me with his usual dry cordiality, and soon my chair by the fire and my old desk were as familiar as ever. The London march that year was of a peculiarly raw and cheerless character, and we were content to sit with the curtains drawn and the fire piled high. Outside, the wind sobbed along the chimney and rattled the panes, while the ceaseless murmur of the great city came to us in dull undertones. Holmes lay at length upon the sofa, in his favourite attitude, with his long thin arms folded and his eyes half closed. I had been engaged upon some notes of our earlier adventures when a sharp tap sounded upon the door leading to the stair. Holmes's grey eyes opened and flashed for a moment, and then he glanced across at me.
If you oblige me, Watson, we shall perhaps add another little problem to your chronicles.
Before I could reply, the door opened, and Mrs. Hudson presented herself upon the threshold with an air of subdued excitement.
If you please, sir, there are two gentlemen asking to see you, and they look sadly put about.
Be so good as to show them up, Mrs. Hudson, and you may put on a little more cold for our fancy. We shall not part with them quickly.
A moment later our landlady retired, and the heavy steps of visitors sounded upon the stair.
They were ushered in, and I rose to greet them, while Holmes merely inclined his head from the sofa. The first was a clergyman in a plain black coat, with the white tie that proclaims his calling, and a face worn and earnest. The second was a spare scholarly person, somewhat stooping in the shoulders, with a narrow ascetic countenance and spectacles that caught the light. The clergyman halted upon the threshold with a movement of embarrassment, while his companion advanced a little into the room.
You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I take it, and this would be the doctor who has set down some of your exploits.
Pray come in, both of you, and draw up to the fire, for the day is inhospitable.
The pair took the chairs which I placed for them, and I could observe them more closely in the stronger light of the hearth. The clergyman I saw to be of middle age, with a kindly but anxious expression and the air of a man more used to parish cares than to London mysteries. His companion was older, and his hair already streaked with grey, but there was a certain vigour in his eye which spoke of an active intelligence.
You do us an honour, gentlemen, and I gather from your faces that it is no trivial matter which brings you to Baker Street.
Indeed, sir, it is a serious trouble, and one that touches not only ourselves, but the welfare of certain poor lads who look to us for their future.
The scholar turned his pale face towards us, and there was a twitching of the mouth which betrayed his inward agitation.
Our names may have little weight with you, yet I think you may have heard one of them in another connection. I am Professor Edgar Willoughby of St. Jude's College, and this is the Reverend Septimus Chisleyhurst, Vicar of St. Athanasius in Bloomsbury.
The names, indeed, were not unknown to me, for St. Jude's was a growing institution, and the professor's writings upon moral philosophy had been commended in the journals.
Holmes inclined his head a fraction, but his gaze had grown cold and analytical as it dwelt upon the visitor's worn cuffs and ink-stained fingers.
You have come together, which is already significant, and you come neither as prosecutor nor as culprit, but as men in some common distress. Pray state the facts as plainly as you can, and begin at the point where the matter first assumed an unusual character in your eyes.
It began, in truth, some years ago, though the particular horror of our present position dates from no longer ago than yesterday morning.
The vicar clasped his thin hands upon his knee, and his voice shook slightly as he addressed us.
St. Athanasius, as perhaps you know, is a poor parish hemmed in by lodging houses and small shops, and peopled for the most part by those who live from week to week. It was my desire to lift at least a few of our brightest lads out of the grinding life, and it was with the kind help of the professor that a charitable scheme was contrived.
The plan was of the simplest, yet I had some pride in it, which has now been turned to gall. Each year we hold a scholarship examination, and the winner is received without fees at St. Jude's, where he may proceed as far as his talents carry him. I myself set the papers, and I have had charge of their secrecy from the first until this present calamity.
Holmes shifted slightly, and I saw the keen line of his profile against the red glow of the fire.
You speak of secrecy, Professor, which suggests that the matter before us touches upon information withheld and information betrayed. Continue, if you please, and let us come from the general to the particular.
3 days ago I completed this year's set of questions and copied them fair upon college paper. In order that they might not lie in my own rooms, where prying eyes are not unknown, I carried the sealed envelope to St. Athanasius. There in the vestry it has been our custom to place the papers in a stout oak alms box which the vicar keeps as a receptacle for the Sunday collections.
The chest is old and strongly made with an iron lock, and only 2 keys are in existence, one of which is in my possession and the other in that of the churchwarden. The slit is narrow enough for coin and folded notes, yet there is room to pass an envelope such as that which the professor entrusted to me.
I accompanied the vicar to the vestry 3 days since and saw with my own eyes the envelope laid at the bottom of the chest beneath the rustle of coins. The alms box was then locked and has not, to my knowledge, been opened again until yesterday, when the vicar and I examined its contents in your honour's service.
Holmes raised one hand gently as if to arrest the current of the narrative.
Yet you say that the calamity dates from yesterday morning, and not from the day the envelope was placed in the box. What occurred yesterday that changed this innocent charity into a matter of crime?
Yesterday morning there came to me an anonymous letter which has shaken me to the soul.
The professor thrust his hand into the inner pocket of his frayed frock coat and brought forth a long envelope, which he laid upon the table. Holmes drew it towards him with the tips of his fingers and examined the outside with as much reverence as if it were some rare specimen. The writing was in a cramped, unformed hand, and the paper of the cheapest sort, discoloured at the edges by much handling.
You have not shown this to anyone outside the room?
To no one except the vicar, who read it with me and urged that we come to you without delay.
Then, with your permission, I will read it aloud so that my colleague may share in the impression it makes.
Holmes broke the envelope and unfolded the single sheet it contained, holding it near to the lamp, while his eyes travelled slowly along the lines.
The words were ill-spelt, yet they were set down with a curious precision of detail that gave them a sinister weight. In substance, the letter accused Professor Willoughby of having sold advance information concerning the scholarship papers in order to discharge his debts at a certain gambling club. It spoke with mocking familiarity of a night when the red 17 on the roulette table had ruined him, and named the exact sum which he was said to have lost. The writer declared that he had proof of the professor's infamy, and threatened that unless the latter resigned both his college post and his parish work he would publish the story in the newspapers. It was further asserted that the sealed envelope in the alms box had already been opened, and that the questions were in the hands of those who could pay for them. Holmes refolded the letter, and for a moment there was silence save for the crackling of the fire.
You will not be surprised, Professor, that I ask whether there is any foundation of truth under this edifice of accusation.
If by foundation you mean that I have at any time staked money at the gaming table, I must confess that I have done so, and more than once. I have a speculative temper, and the fascination of chance has been to me what the fascination of the unknown is to my scientific brethren. I have calculated systems and tested them upon the wheel and upon the turf, and I have been both winner and loser. There was indeed such a night as the letter describes, when a run of red 17 undid me to the tune of £300. But I swear to you on my honour as a man and as a teacher that I have never bartered the future of a boy for the turn of a card.
You admit, therefore, the background which gives colour to the anonymous charge, yet you deny the specific crime.
I deny it utterly, and if I could not deny it, I should not dare to sit in this room.
I will vouch for his character with all the strength I possess, for I have known him in our work, and I could not believe that he would betray these children.
Holmes leaned forward now, his elbows upon his knees and the letter held lightly between finger and thumb.
Let us take stock of our position. There exists an examination which offers a precious prize to a poor boy, and the questions for that examination were sealed and locked in a box at St. Athanasius. There exists also an anonymous accuser who knows not only the fact of the examination, but details of the professor's financial history, which are not likely to be common gossip. He asserts that the envelope has been opened and that the information has been sold. Our task then is to discover whether the envelope has indeed been tampered with in fact, and whether the charge of sale is supported by independent evidence. Have you opened the alms box since receiving this letter?
We have not yet dared to do so. It seemed to me that if the seal were indeed broken, it was better that your eye should be the first to observe it.
You have done wisely. We will, if you please, repair to St. Athanasius at once and examine the box and its contents before any other hand has touched them. But before we go, there is one thing more which I must ask of you, Professor, and it is a thing that you may find unpleasant.
I'm prepared to submit to any questioning if only you can clear this foul cloud from above my head.
I muster from you in writing a precise account of your movements during the past week so far as they bear upon these papers and upon your appearances at St. Athanasius. I shall ask you for the days and the hours and the names of any persons who were in your company. It will be of the first importance that we should possess an exact chronology.
I understand the necessity, though it stings me that my veracity should be called into such arithmetic. Yet I will do it.
You will find writing materials upon the table, and you may compose your memorandum while we journey together to the church, for we shall not require your presence in the vestry during the first inspection.
Within half an hour we had been driven through the grey streets to Bloomsbury, and were making our way on foot down a narrow passage which gave upon the side door of St. Athanasius. The church rose before us in dingy brick with a squat tower that showed dark against a cheerless sky.
Within it was chill and full of that faint odour of stone and vestments which clings about old churches.
The vicar led us through the dim nave to a small door near the chancel and so into the vestry, which was a plain room with a table, a press, and a single narrow window. Upon a low stand under the window stood the alms box of which he had spoken.
It was a massive oak chest bound with iron and scarred with many scratches of time in use.
In the centre of the lid was a slot scarcely wider than a man's finger, and at the front a brass keyhole with a rim polished by frequent handling.
Here it is, Mr. Holmes, and my key is in my hand if you desire that I should open it.
One instant before you do so. Watson, pray observe the word about the keyhole.
I stooped beside him and saw that fine fresh scratches radiated from the polished rim as though some instrument harder than a key had been pressed against it.
You perceive that the lock has been in use more recently than the rest of the surface would lead us to suppose. Pray proceed, Vicar.
The reverend gentleman inserted his key and turned it with a little metallic snick. Then he lifted the heavy lid upon its creaking hinges.
Holmes's long arms shot forward and his thin hands moved among the contents with the swift delicacy of a surgeon.
At the bottom, upon a litter of small silver and copper, lay a large buff envelope sealed in red wax. Beside it there was a cheap tin money box painted a harsh blue and bearing upon its side in sprawling pencil the words "Tommy's Rent." Near the corner of the chest there was also a crumpled circular, printed in coarse type and adorned with gaudy borders. Holmes took the envelope and held it against the light, then laid it aside without yet breaking the seal. He lifted the tin box and shook it so that the coins within gave a modest jingle. Finally he smoothed out the circular upon the vestry table.
You recognize this, I think, Professor.
Willoughby had followed us to the door of the vestry and stood there trembling between hope and dread.
I recognize the nature of it, though I trust that it has no connection with my own follies.
Holmes read aloud some portions of the circular which announced the virtues of a certain gambling establishment not far from Leicester Square and extolled a system of play by which the most cautious investor might secure handsome and steady winnings.
A singular document to find at the bottom of an alms box in a poor parish. I presume you had no notion that it was there, Vicar.
None at all, then I am ashamed that such trust should lie among the mites of my people.
We will not at present seek how it came there. These small matters have a way of fitting themselves together later. Now tell me whose Tommy whose rent appears upon this little box.
He is one of our altar boys, a sharp lad with a good head on his shoulders. His father died last year, and his mother takes him washing and mending in order that they may keep a tiny room over a cobbler's shop. The boy has been putting aside pence for months that he may one day pay their rent in advance and so give his mother a little piece. It was his own thought, and I confess it touched me deeply.
It touches me also, though my heart is not often moved in ecclesiastical surroundings. He's one of the candidates for the scholarship, is he not?
Indeed he is, and I had high hopes of him.
So we have an examination worth a boy's future, a professor who holds the keys of knowledge, a charity box, and a child's rent box lying side by side with an invitation to the gambling table. It is a curious juxtaposition.
Holmes replaced the tin box and the circular, but retained the buff envelope in his hand.
I shall take this with me for a more minute examination. In the meantime, I must ask that the alms box remain as it is without further disturbance until I give you leave to open it again.
You shall have my promise most readily, for the whole thing alarms me.
We left the church and returned to Baker Street, the professor silent and sunk in his own thoughts while the vicar murmured prayers under his breath. On the way, Holmes requested that Professor Willoughby should complete the written account of his recent movements, of which he had already drafted some lines. By the time our cab set us down at the familiar door, the memorandum was ready, and the professor delivered it into Holmes's hand with a stiff bow.
There is all that you asked for, set down with such exactitude as my memory allows.
You have done well. If you and the vicar will now excuse us, I shall study this with Dr. Watson, and we will communicate with you as soon as we have reached any definite conclusion.
Our clients withdrew, and Holmes flung himself once more upon the sofa with the paper spread upon his knees.
I took my old armchair opposite him and waited in silence for his observations.
The memorandum was arranged in numbered items, giving the day and hour of each incident. According to this account, the professor had finished drafting the questions upon Monday evening and had copied them fair on Tuesday. On Wednesday at noon he had carried the sealed envelope to St. Athanasius, and in the presence of the vicar had seen it placed in the alms box. On Thursday and Friday he had been engaged in college duties and had not left the neighbourhood except to dine at his club. On Saturday morning the anonymous letter had reached him by the first post, and after consultation with the vicar he had at once decided to come to Baker Street. Holmes read the paper twice without comment and then laid it upon the table between us.
You have heard the story, Watson, and you have seen the objects that form its visible framework. What in your view is the essential question that confronts us?
I considered for a little while before replying. It seemed to me that the most pressing point lay in discovering the identity of the writer of the anonymous letter.
I ventured to say so.
That is indeed of interest, but it is not the first thing. We must begin not with personalities, but with the nature of the crime if crime there be. Are the papers safe, or have they been tampered with? If tampered with, who had their opportunity, and with what motive did he employ it? The letter may be true or false, or partly one and partly the other, but the state of that seal will not lie.
He rose as he spoke, and with great care broke the wax upon the buff envelope which he had brought from the church. The packet contained several sheets closely written with questions in the professor's small precise hand. Holmes spread them upon the table without giving me time to read them and turned his attention rather to the envelope itself.
He examined the remaining fragments of wax under the lens and then threw them upon a sheet of black paper which he held near the lamp.
Here is our first little illumination. You observe this fragment, which is darker and smoother than the others. That is original wax. Now observe how along the edge of the flat there is a second line, more granular and of a slightly different hue. That tells us that the seal has been softened and remade.
I took the glass at his bidding and could indeed see that the wax near the corners had a fresher look, as if it had been fused more recently.
Furthermore, among the grains of wax there are tiny threads of some coarse fabric. You see how they cling at this point and at this.
The threads were so small as to be almost invisible, yet under the magnifier one could trace their fibrous structure.
I have noticed that the professor's coat cuffs are frayed, and that he is accustomed to use a sleeve instead of a blotting pad. It would not surprise me if these threads matched the cloth of his coat.
I stared at him in astonishment, for the implication of his words was plain enough.
The idea that our scholarly visitor had himself tampered with the seal jarred with my sense of his character.
Holmes, however, had already passed on, as is his wont, from observation to deduction.
We have established that the envelope has twice been sealed, once when it left the professor's hand in the ordinary course, and once again at a later time by a clumsy hand, which allowed these fibres to intrude. The question is at what point in the chronology the second sealing took place.
I pointed out that according to the memorandum the envelope had not left the alms box from the time it was deposited there until we ourselves removed it. Holmes smiled very slightly and shook his head.
You are accepting without reserve a chronology which is itself part of the evidence and therefore may be tainted. That is the very error into which our professor hopes that others will fall. I have long made it a rule not only to weigh facts but to weigh the order in which they are presented to me.
He picked up the memorandum and tapped it with a long forefinger.
This neat little list is a construction, and every construction implies a constructor and a purpose. We shall test it tomorrow by gathering independent testimony as to how the week really passed.
The morrow found us abroad earlier upon an expedition of which Holmes refused to give me any full explanation.
Our steps led us first to a narrow court off Leicester Square, where a sinister-looking house with a swinging lamp over its door proclaimed the presence of a gaming club. Holmes produced from somewhere a card of introduction, which was received with marked respect by the servant who opened to us. Within we found a set of rooms richly furnished and already sprinkled with those languid patrons who do not wait for the night in order to pursue their costly amusement. Roulette tables stood at one end, while at another there were green cloth boards for cards and markers for various games of chance. We took our places at a side table and ordered some slight refreshment, while Holmes allowed his quick glance to travel over the faces in the room. Presently he rose and stepped carelessly against a heavy-jawed man who sat near the roulette wheel with a little pile of gold before him.
I beg your pardon.
His tone suggested the apology of a gentleman to an equal, yet there was a curious intimacy in the glance which he bent upon the man. The fellow grunted some acknowledgment and turned again to his play, but I had seen a quick meeting of their eyes. When we had left the place some 10 minutes later, I could not refrain from asking who the man might be.
He's known here as Cribs, and he lends money upon terms which would surprise a provincial bank manager. It is in such hands that a ruined gambler generally falls.
I protested that this told us nothing as to Professor Willoughby.
On the contrary, it tells us that his affairs have been talked of in the club, for the fellow quoted the amount of his loss and the very number upon the wheel. We shall hear his name again.
In the afternoon we visited the humble dwelling of Tommy Briggs and his mother in a narrow side street not far from the church. The woman we found bending over a tub while the boy sorted parcels of linen upon a chair.
If it is about the boy, sir, he has done nothing wrong, for he is as honest as the day.
We assured her that we came not in the spirit of accusation, but of inquiry, and we questioned the lad as to his rent box. He told us with eager pride how he had been putting by coins ever since Christmas, that his mother might one day lie down to sleep without fear of the landlord. He had placed the little box in the alms chest 3 days ago when the vicar had praised his thoughtfulness. Holmes patted the boy's head, and there was a rare gentleness in his manner as he did so.
Whatever comes of this business, you may be sure that your good intention will not be turned to your harm.
As we walked back towards Baker Street, the daylight was already failing and the lamps glimmered through the damp air.
Holmes paced with his head bent and his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his overcoat.
Twice he muttered to himself, and once he drew forth his notebook and made a brief entry in it. At last he turned to me with decision in his eye.
Our next step, Watson, is a return visit to St. Athanasius, but this time I must go alone. I have to make certain observations in the vestry which would be hampered by the presence of others.
I could see that he was in a mood of concentrated energy when interference of any sort is unwelcome.
I therefore acquiesced and returned to our rooms while he went on his solitary errand. It was late when he at length came back, and I saw by his face that his expedition had not been fruitless. Without answering my questions, he drew off his gloves and took from his pocket a small object wrapped in tissue paper.
During my absence, I think you have been reading a medical journal, which contains an article upon the microscopic examination of fibres.
I admitted that this was so, and Holmes smiled.
You will then the more readily appreciate that these fibres which I found caught in the wax of the envelope require a comparison specimen. I have obtained such a specimen.
He unfolded the paper and displayed a scrap of cloth which I recognized as part of the lining of Professor Willoughby's coat sleeve.
The vicar was so good as to lend me the garment for a moment under the plea that I wished to observe a stain upon the cuff. Under the lens there is no appreciable difference between these threads and those which were embedded in the wax. We may say therefore that the last sealing of that envelope was performed by no other hand than that of the professor himself.
The conclusion seemed undeniable, yet I could not reconcile it with the man's manifest distress and his previous reputation. I said as much.
My dear Watson, you have heard me maintain again and again that the emotional nature is no barrier to crime. On the contrary, it often supplies the strongest motive and the most ingenious subterfuge. We shall presently see what form it takes in this case.
He took up the memorandum once more and spread it between us.
Here is his own arrangement of events. He finishes the questions Monday, copies them Tuesday, takes them to the church Wednesday morning, and never goes near the place again until he accompanies us. But we have the evidence of the verger that he admitted himself by the side door on Friday evening and remained in the vestry for some time.
I exclaimed at this revelation, for it was new to me.
I learned it during my second visit to the church. The verger regarded it as an insignificant matter, but it is precisely such matters which turn the scale. We must therefore rearrange our order of events, placing this secret visit in its true position, and asking ourselves with what object he made it.
Holmes took a sheet of paper and rapidly jotted down a series of brief phrases with arrows between them.
He placed the verger's Friday night observation before the posting of the anonymous letter and before the professor's resolve to come to us.
You perceive the significance. The professor would have us think that the letter came first, the suspicion second, and any tampering, if tampering there were, as a third step. In truth, the tampering was prior to the letter, and the letter was part of the device by which he sought to cast suspicion elsewhere.
The conclusion burst upon me with sudden clarity. I saw that if the professor himself had opened and resealed the envelope and then written a letter purporting to come from a blackmailer, he might pose as the victim of a crime which he had in fact committed.
I said so in some heat.
Precisely. He has not only falsified individual facts, he has falsified the sequence of facts. That is the essence of his trick, and it is one of the most subtle which we have encountered.
I asked how Holmes proposed to prove so grave a charge.
By confronting him with an accomplice, he knows more of the affair than he imagines, and by placing before both of them certain documents, which I hope to secure tomorrow.
The morrow was devoted to what I may call the legal side of our inquiry, for Holmes spent several hours with Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard. In the evening the inspector accompanied him to Baker Street, and I was speedily made acquainted with the position.
It is a queer business, Doctor, and I am bound to say that your friend seems to see daylight where we at the Yard perceived nothing but fog. This fellow Cribbs, whom he has pointed out to us, is as hard a nut as any in London, but we have a line upon him now. It appears that he has been trafficking in all manner of irregular information and has twice before been suspected of tampering with examination papers, though we could never bring it home.
The point which interests us is that he has recently been in correspondence with Professor Willoughby. You have that correspondence, Lestrade.
I have it, and more besides. When we took him upon a little matter of forged bills, we had occasion to search his rooms, and we found a bundle of letters tied together with a rubber band. Most were of the usual sort, promises to pay and so on, but 3 were in the professor's hand upon college paper.
Lestrade laid upon the table 3 folded sheets, each bearing the crest of St. Jude's.
Holmes ran his eye rapidly over them while I followed more slowly.
The earliest was couched in guarded terms, speaking of a certain understanding regarding the circulation of information and begging for strict secrecy.
The second referred to a sum which had been received in consideration of this service and hinted at the possibility of further co-operation.
The third was of a different tone entirely, and threatened that if Cribbs made any use of the knowledge he possessed, the writer would denounce him to the authorities.
The dates upon the letters were of extreme importance, for they showed that the transaction with Cribbs preceded the composing of the anonymous letter and the subsequent appeal to Holmes.
You perceive, Watson, how our line of reasoning is supported. First, the professor makes an illicit bargain with a moneylender for the sale of his trust. Then his conscience and his fears awake. He seeks to extricate himself not by confession, but by deceit, and for that purpose he rearranges the apparent order of events. He opens the alms box alone on Friday night, tampers with the envelope, plants the betting circular, and perhaps removes and replaces certain coins. Then he writes to himself a letter purporting to come from the very scoundrel whom he fears, and he rushes to us with the story of his wrongs.
I could not but admire the devilish ingenuity of the scheme, even while I loathed the weakness which had led to it.
Holmes turned now to Lestrade.
You will be so good as to bring Cribbs here tomorrow at 11. You may tell him that it concerns certain forged bills on which we desire his explanation. You will also invite Professor Willoughby and the Reverend Chisleyhurst to favour us at the same hour.
You mean to confront them all together?
It will save time, and it will be instructive for each of them.
Punctually at 11 next morning our sitting room presented as curious an assembly as it had ever seen.
The professor sat rigid in his chair, his face paler than ever, and his eyes burning behind their glasses.
The vicar fidgeted upon the edge of his seat, with his worn gloves clasped and unclasped in nervous fingers.
Cribbs lounged near the door between two stalwart constables who had escorted him and whose presence he accepted with a sullen indifference. Lestrade stood by the mantelpiece, his notebook in his hand, while Holmes occupied his familiar place upon the rug with his back against the fire.
You are wondering, no doubt, Professor Willoughby, why you have been asked to share your morning with this company. I shall make the reason clear in a few words. You have been the victim of a very real temptation, and you have yielded to it.
I deny that utterly.
You will be better advised to reserve your denials until you have heard the whole case. You are in serious pecuniary embarrassment through losses incurred at play. You entered into an arrangement with this man Cribbs by which you gave him a copy of the questions for the St. Jude's scholarship examination in return for a sum of money.
It is false.
You wrote to him upon college paper in guarded but unmistakable terms, and these letters came into the possession of the police when he was recently arrested. Here is the first of them.
Holmes handed the sheet to the professor, who glanced at it and then let it fall from his trembling fingers.
Here is the second, in which you acknowledge the sum received. Here is the third, written later, when your conscience had begun to trouble you and you feared the consequences of your act. You threatened to denounce him if he made use of the knowledge.
The professor's lips moved, but no sound came from them. The vicar had risen to his feet, his face ashen under the shock of this revelation.
Say that it is not true, Edgar. For the love of heaven, say that it is not true.
It is better that he should not lie to you, vicar. I regret exceedingly that I must overthrow your trust in your friend, but I have no choice. The chain of evidence is complete. He not only sold the papers, he afterwards endeavoured to hide his treachery by falsifying the sequence of events and by presenting himself to you as the victim of a blackmailer.
Cribbs laughed harshly and shrugged his shoulders.
You see how it is, parson. I may be a rogue, but I did not make a scholar of his kind go crooked.
You will keep your comments for the proper place, Cribbs. For the moment it is enough that your own letters and the testimony of the club servants establish your part in the affair. If you are wise, you will render what assistance he can in clearing up the rest.
Holmes turned once more to the professor, whose head had sunk upon his breast.
You went alone to St. Athanasius on Friday night and opened the alms box with the vicar's key, which you had previously borrowed under some pretext. You removed the envelope, and having already given a copy of the questions to Cribbs, you now sought to make it appear that any tampering had occurred only at this later date. You softened the wax with a vestry candle, broke the seal, read the paper in order to assure yourself that the original still remained, then applied fresh wax, using your sleeve to press the seal into place. In doing so, you left certain fibres embedded in the wax which correspond exactly with those of your coat cuff. You then dropped into the chest the circular from the club which you had brought with you and perhaps rearranged the coins so that the envelope should lie as we found it. The following morning you wrote the anonymous letter to yourself, describing your own fault as though it were the deed of another and casting upon Cribbs the role of blackmailer. Having thus manufactured both a crime and an accuser, you came in haste to Baker Street with the vicar in order that we might give a seal of authenticity to the deception.
For a long moment there was dead silence in the room save for the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. At last the professor lifted his head and looked from one face to another with a strange blending of defiance and despair.
You are a terrible man, Holmes. It seems that nothing can be hidden from you. Since you have stripped me naked, you shall have the whole truth. It is as you say, that I lost heavily and that I fell into the clutches of this man. He suggested that a copy of the examination papers would be worth much to certain parents who desired a sure future for their sons. At first I rejected the thought with horror, but the figure of my creditor rose before me and the wheel with its remorseless red and black seemed to whirl in my brain. I told myself that I was not harming the boys, but only equalizing the chances among them. So I made the copy and I met his agent and I received the money. Then I was seized with loathing for myself. Every time I saw those lads in church I felt that I had betrayed them. I thought of Tommy Briggs and his rent box, and I knew that if the thing were discovered he would be the first to suffer, for some would say that the poor are always the first to cheat. I had not the courage to confess, and I had not the courage to endure the possible consequences if Cribbs chose to speak. So I did indeed conceive the scheme which you have laid bare. I thought that if I could show that the papers had been tampered with only yesterday, and that I myself had called in the great detective, I might escape as a man wronged rather than guilty. I see now the folly as well as the wickedness of that hope.
The vicar sank once more into his chair and covered his face with his hands.
He was a simple man, and the revelation of such duplicity in a companion whom he had honoured was more than he could bear.
I cannot follow all these subtleties. I only know that a soul which I trusted has fallen very low.
There is still a question of what is to be done. For my own part, I have no desire that the scandal should be made public beyond what is necessary. The boys and their parents and the parish at large should not be made to suffer for the weakness of one man and the greed of another.
The law must take its course all the same. This Cribbs will not slip through our fingers this time, and the letters will be useful in dealing with him. As for the professor, it might be possible to handle matters quietly if the higher authorities consent and if he is prepared to resign his position.
That is my view also. He must withdraw from St. Jude's and from St. Athanasius and disappear from the sphere in which this betrayal has taken place. If he does so at once, and if he undertakes never again to hold a post of trust, I for one shall say nothing to press the law further.
You are more merciful than I deserve. I will resign today, and I will leave England. It may be that in some remote place I shall be able to do a little good before I die, and so make a poor atonement.
Cribbs muttered something under his breath, but the grasp of the constable upon his arm tightened, and he was led away together with Lestrade.
The vicar remained long after the others had gone, speaking sadly with Holmes and with me.
I shall have to face my people and explain that the examination is postponed and that there has been a fault in our arrangements. I will say nothing of names. They have trusted me, and I must not shatter that trust if I can help it.
You have my sympathy, Vicar. You have been sinned against rather than sinning. If you will take my advice, you will set new papers under another hand, and you will never again suffer them to lie in any receptacle less secure than a bank vault.
When at last he too had departed, Holmes flung himself back into his chair and stretched his long legs towards the fire.
It is a singular fate, Watson, that a man who has spent his life in tracing the consequences of actions should himself be wrecked upon a moral syllogism. Our professor constructed a theory by which he persuaded himself that his betrayal was a mere redistribution of chances, and then he constructed a second theory by which he hoped to escape the consequences of the first. Both have come to shipwreck upon the rock of fact.
I observed that the case appeared to me to turn more upon his conscience and upon our powers.
Do not underrate the importance of the little indications. A scratch by a keel, a scrap of printed paper, a flake of wax, and a few threads of cloth, these were the stepping stones by which we passed from ignorance to certainty. It is true that the moral edifice was in ruins before we touched it, but that is often the way with such structures.
Some weeks later I had occasion to call once more upon the vicar of St. Athanasius, and I learned what had been the outcome of our intervention.
The examination had been entirely rearranged under the supervision of another don from St. Jude's, and the questions had been kept in the strong room of a city bank until the hour came.
The boys sat with bright, eager faces, and the scholarship was finally awarded not to Tommy Briggs, but to another lad scarcely less deserving.
Tommy, however, received a consolation, which was perhaps more immediately useful, for an anonymous benefactor had sent to the vicar sum sufficient to pay the poor woman's rent for a year and to purchase for the boy certain books and clothing.
I had my own notion as to the identity of that benefactor, but Holmes, when I hinted it to him, only shrugged those eloquent shoulders of his.
It is possible, Watson, that some wealthy admirer of youthful thrift passed through Bloomsbury and was touched by the tale. It is also possible that a very humble practitioner of detection sometimes allows himself the luxury of doing a good turn in secret.
I smiled at this evasion, yet I knew that I should never draw from him a more direct acknowledgment.
Of Professor Willoughby I heard nothing further save a brief notice in a journal that he had resigned his chair on the plea of failing health and had left England for a warmer climate.
Perhaps in some colonial school or in some lonely mission station he is seeking to rebuild the character which crumbled so pitifully under the pressure of temptation. The alms box of St. Athanasius now bears a small brass plate stating that it is to be used for the poor of the parish only and that all other valuables are to be deposited elsewhere. Whenever I see it in my mind's eye, I recall the curious manner in which a few trifling objects within it revealed a whole tragedy of conscience, calculation, and fear.
Holmes himself regarded the matter with a certain grim satisfaction.
This case, Watson, has a special interest for me. Most crimes rest upon some obvious motive such as greed or jealousy or revenge. Here the motive was partly these, yet it was also the very faculty by which men reason about right and wrong. A man misused his intellect not only to plan his profit, but to rearrange the order of his past in such a way that he might believe himself less guilty than he was. When a man begins to falsify his own memory, he stands in greater peril than if he falsified the coinage of the realm.
I have set down this adventure among those which, for various reasons, were not made public during the lifetime of my friend, though they weighed much with me in forming my estimate of his powers. If you have listened thus far to my reminiscences of the affair of the alms box, I am sincerely grateful for your patience and attention.
If the story has afforded you any measure of interest, I would ask you kindly to show it by giving your approval in the form of a like, and by subscribing to this modest channel in which these untold cases are preserved. Your comments too are always of value, for they allow me to learn which features of these old chronicles most engage your curiosity and sympathy. Should you feel inclined to support more directly the continuation of these narratives, I am informed that a small square sign in the lower right corner of your screen or the link in the description below will guide any contribution safely to our hands. In that same description you will discover not only other episodes of these untold adventures, but also tales belonging to quite different series, which may perhaps please you in another mood. For the present, I bid you a most cordial farewell, and I hope that you will join Holmes and myself again when next we draw back the curtain from another of those forgotten cases which lay so long in my dispatch box.